All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today we are going to be going through chapters 9 and 10 of Locke's second treatise on government. They're both fairly short chapters. I did notes and critique on one of them and said this is not that much. And so I did chapter 10 as well. So let's get to it. Chapter 9, of the ends of political society and government. Now this is one of those chapters that I really think should have been earlier in the book because here's how Locke starts it up. If a man is in the state of nature and is so free, why would he give that up? Well, in nature, man has rights but very limited security of those rights. He is plagued by fears and continual dangers from other people who are similarly in the state of nature. I've been saying this over and over again because it really is important to get this point down earlier, but Locke decided to put it in chapter 9. It's worth noting that by this logic, kind of the minimum society that there would be like enough people to cover all the watches around a campfire. That's your kind of smallest, society in a Lockean sense. Enough people so that there's always someone awake, so that no one can just take your stuff while you're sleeping. Okay. So, from here, Locke goes on to describe what he believes to be the proper ends of government. Now, he kind of phrases this in a strange way, because he says that the preservation of property is the proper end of government, and then he starts to enumerate other things that government should do, starting with first. So, he says first, second, third, but there's actually kind of four things here. So, and maybe it's that, his first, second, third are all pushing toward the preservation of property, but it's not 100% clear that his three sub-objects are only directed towards the preservation of property. And I would say he's not explicit about that. So anyway, of the three things that he says the purpose of them is for the preservation of property, number one is established, settled, known law. In other words, an executive branch. I'm sorry, a legislative branch. Then we've got number two is known and indifferent judges, a judicial branch. And then number three is the collective power to enforce judicial decisions without super high levels of danger to the enforcers. And that's basically the executive branch. Basically, Locke has already recognized that the average that a man is likely to say, hey, I see that you ruled against me here, but I'm not going to go quietly into that ruling because it is against me. That this is definitely a possibility that people need to concern themselves with in society, and therefore the purpose of the executive branch is basically to have enough power so that no individual recalcitrant defendant can break free of his justly appropriated punishment. And of course, again, Locke has played with tacit consent, but in general, his concept of consent is fairly solid. And so, in that sense, the recalcitrant defendants often have agreed, usually mostly explicitly, to these kinds of punishments for things that they've been decided against in courts. But again, the notion that not everybody is just going to give up and hand themselves in is something that a society needs to deal with, at least according to Locke. So, next he talks about, what are the powers that are given up by those who join a society? He kind of reiterates that in the state of nature, you have an unrestricted right to act within the laws of reason for your own self-preservation. And in fact, many men, he says, act beyond the laws of reason to ensure their self-preservation. In society, he says, you can be regulated by laws that are made by the society. Of course, from a voluntarist perspective, this is extremely dangerous. Limitations on arms, eventual destruction of self-preservation, maybe going via property and then going on to yourself. We've seen this kind of outgrowth of government happen where the justice system is designed to find the guilty as best as possible, and to not necessarily, and to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to the innocent. We have presumption of innocence, we have jury trial, etc., etc., etc. Over time, what happens is that punishments start to get kind of wonky. The laws start to not make a whole lot of sense about punishment. We have a situation where restitution is completely abandoned from legal punishments. Basically, there's a whole separate system. The civil system and the criminal system separate from each other, and the criminal system no longer seeks to make whole the people who are wronged. It only seeks to punish those who are doing the wronging. And then we get the push towards lighter sentences, more judicial kind of like niceties, where people who have been proven to be aggressors in various cases get very little punishment. They're still open to civil penalties, but they don't have any assets to take in a civil judgment. So nobody bothers, right? At this point, we start to have the breakdown of the defense of property, because now we have, there's no point in defending. It's just a TV. Let them have it. And then we start to have a society that's no longer based on the preservation of property, which, as Locke says, is the most important thing that society can do. And society is already kind of failing at this point, but it still has a facade, and it certainly still has the structures that enable the enforcement of the law against recalcitrant defendants. Only in this case, now the recalcitrant defendants are people who are defending their property against thieves, robbers, etc. After that, self-defense itself starts to become under attack. As we've seen these days, the right to keep and bear arms is under constant attack by people who say, well, you should just run away. You should just, give up. You should just call the police. And what this does is it creates more dependency on the state apparatus, which is not, according to Locke, the purpose of the state apparatus. It is not to create dependency. It is to preserve property, to have established, settled, known laws, known and indifferent judges, and the collective power to enforce judicial decisions against defendants who've run against these settled, known laws. Not to have people saying, oh, well, we're going to just let you off, we're going to let you off, we're going to let you off, and, they're going to go rob a shoe store again or whatever, who knows. This is kind of where things start to fail, right? Where preservation of property no longer becomes the ends of government, and rather the self-preservation of government becomes the end of government. At that point, you start to have a tyranny. The second power that Locke discusses about that is given up by those who join society is the ability to punish crimes or punish perceived crimes. In the state of nature, remember, a person has the right to punish up to and including death, a person who steals from him, who murders, his family member or something like that. And there's no higher authority to say, well, we have decided to have this process to determine if this person is guilty, and then their punishment is this range of things based on these legal doctrines that have been set down and are written and are known to everybody, right? In the state of nature, a bad person doesn't necessarily just attack somebody else. He might convince another person that someone else has wronged him and make it a fabrication, right? Person A says to person B, person C stole my bike, and person B is, angry about this, and it's like, well, we can't let person C get away with stealing a bike, and goes and attacks person C. This is the kind of thing that can happen in the state of nature, and one of the points of society is to take all of this and move it to indifferent judges who are not, who are supposed to not be swayed by this kind of like, hey, so-and-so did this, but rather rules of evidence and laws and things like that. So, in joining a society, a person gives up the individual right to do this, but instead gets a partial right to kind of participate in enforcement of society laws per the laws, either by being, hired as a sheriff by the government, by being a jury member, things like that. It's important to note here to remember that in the earlier chapter, Locke says that as far as punishments for crimes go, restitution cannot be pardoned, only the extra punitive stuff can be pardoned. So Locke has already stated that part of the fundamental method of justice should be to make the person who was wronged whole. And we have a complete dissolution of that these days. Oftentimes, there's no, the person who's been wronged has absolutely no recourse for getting back what he has lost. So that's worth noting how kind of modern United States society is failing in that respect. Moving on, Locke also notes that there are three major obligations of those holding power. Number one, to govern by established standing laws, promulgated and known to the people, and not by arbitrary decree. Remember that earlier Locke was like, well, even in society, a man has a right to be free of the arbitrary rule of another. There was a bunch of different things. It was arbitrary. Let's see if. Well, give me 1 second. I'll see if I can find it. All right, I found it. It's in the start of chapter 4 of Slavery, where a liberty to follow my own will in all things, where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man. So there's those 4 points that are kind of crucial for what society means to Locke. It's also worth noting that there are problems with the concept of like objective law. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there's a guy who did a very long essay article about issues with expecting pure objectivity from laws, and how precedents are never 100% accurate, and you can always say this precedent is more accurate or this precedent is more accurate, and you can often, in a large body of law, find a case where two precedents both seem relatively applicable and ended up in opposite conclusions by the judicial system. I'm going to link to that over on the blog, so go check that out if you want more on that. Further, the second obligation of those holding power is that the judges be indifferent and upright and decide by the laws as they are written. This kind of, again, falls into the issue of the possibility of having purely objective law, but we'll set that aside for the moment. Obligation number 3 of those holding power is that the force of the community must only be used to execute laws or to defend against invaders. Now, again, we have to note that Locke is horizontally integrating here. It is possible to have separate bodies do defense from outside and internal affairs, and in fact, that might be, from a voluntarist perspective, that's probably better, because it requires a different amount of force, right? The force that a police system needs is the amount of force necessary to deal with any individual or small group of defendants, and by definition, that group of defendants will be a small fraction of that society. However, a body that is required, the body with the power that is required to do defense from external invaders, might have to actually take on an entire society that decides to go to war with your own society. Therefore, the police power is necessarily lower than the than the army powers. That is to say, the amount of power that they ought to wield. And this is kind of part of the reason why we have what's it called, posse comitatus, where the army is not supposed to do law enforcement inside the U.S. It's because of this. It's because, I mean, you can make arguments about standing armies, and I understand that entirely, but just to make the point that Locke is trying to make here, or to conclude from what Locke is saying, how things work, we see that the police power is necessarily not as, that the amount of power that a police system needs is almost certainly significantly less than the power that national self-defense would need. Now, of course, one of the ways that, say, the founders dealt with this is by having the national defense be at least partially in the hands of a militia, which is composed of the whole people. This reduces the amount of power that a standing army would need in order to repel possible invading other communities, other commonwealths. And so, like, I think that the people who were, the people who were discussing things in, say, the American Revolutionary period were well aware that of this kind of dichotomy. In fact, they were skeptical of standing armies to begin with, and I think with good reason, because even if a standing army is designed to not do internal affairs stuff, it always, by a corrupt politician, could be twisted into that direction. And we've seen evidence of that happening in various times over the history of the United States. Finally, to end chapter 9, Locke says that the purpose of all of these things that the government does, the end of the obligations of these holding power, the end of the proper ends of government, the ends of giving up your powers by joining society is for this, quote, peace, safety, and public good of the people, end quote. Now, public good is a little bit vague, but peace and safety are pretty standard kind of things. We're kind of seeing cases where if we see cases where the government or any government doesn't enforce these three things, if they don't create peace, safety, and public good, then they really have kind of collapsed as a government already, no matter how much physical power they claim to have at that point. They aren't governments at that point. They aren't proper Lockean-style governments. They're tyrannies that are basically extracting wealth from the people without providing them with the things that a government must provide in order to be justified as a government. Oh. All right. Now, we finished chapter 9. Chapter 10 is another short one. It's called Of the Forms of a Commonwealth. And there's not much here other than a couple of definitions. And again, this is one of those weird things that I don't know if it's what would you call it? Like a trend in how argumentation used to go. But nowadays, we generally put definitions early on in a piece. This chapter contains a bunch of definitions that don't get used that much, but it's basically just kind of Locke saying, here's the different forms of government that can be created and fulfill the requirements of my, Commonwealth government society kind of thing going on. So here we go. Locke makes the point that the majority of the people in a society make the laws. That they have that if a majority can be created to put down a positive law, then that becomes the positive law. Again, we've kind of nitpicked at this a little bit because it could be more than a majority needed to do that. It could be it could be that the scope of the laws that a majority can enact are limited, right? Certain things, even the majority can't take away certain rights of the minority, right? That's kind of one of the things that Locke is not talking about here, but are kind of implied, or at least were kind of built on after Locke to kind of fix it up. But Locke, in this chapter, Locke is making the specific point that whatever majority is required to make the laws, they may also delegate their powers of legislation to a person or a group of persons. And so Locke is basically like, here's a few different forms of government. For instance, if this majority of people does not delegate their powers to a person or small group, then you have a democracy, or even something close to a direct democracy. If you delegate these powers to a group, and that group can either propagate itself via heirs or by successors that are decided by the majority, then you have what Locke calls an oligarchy. A representative republic is technically an oligarchy in Lockean terms. That's worth noting. But then Locke goes on and he says, the majority may also delegate its legislative powers to a man and his heirs, which would be a hereditary monarchy, or to a man but have successors chosen by society, which would be an elective monarchy. The problem with hereditary monarchy or even elective monarchy is that it's kind of a recipe for tyranny if you don't have some kind of clear escape clause, especially for a hereditary monarchy. Because if there's never any point where the power reverts back to the people, to the majority of the people, then that hereditary monarch can simply expand his powers gradually over time until he has way more powers than any Lockean government ought to have. He's no longer serving peace, safety, and public good of the people. Locke doesn't mention that in this chapter, but I think it's worth noting that this is something that probably needs to be considered, right? Like there needs to be some kind of escape clause or escape hatch to a hereditary monarch system, because there might be serious problems that come up over long periods of time, and this is true of any governmental system that exists for a long period of time. For instance, in his group plus heirs oligarchy, say there's a great council, and the great council is hereditary, right? You're basically creating a nobility. There needs to be, in order to avoid this kind of hereditary power being leveraged into unchecked tyranny, there must be some kind of escape clause for the people, or else I would argue that we're kind of in a tyranny, but a non-tyranny in name only. And this is something that, in this chapter in particular, Locke does not really talk about, for what it's worth. Locke also notes that there can be compounded or mixed forms of these different different organizations, and that you may periodically revert legislative authority to the people, and they may either repeat the same structure or change structures at their will. The danger, however, of never reverting is extremely high, right? If the people are just like, yeah, keep it going, we know that governments will continue to try to scope creep, basically. And this is one of those cases where I think Locke is not thinking deeply enough about this problem, especially considering how short this chapter is. The second part, there's like 2 paragraphs in this chapter, and the second paragraph is even more not pointless, but like, this should have happened way earlier in the book, right? He basically says that when he says Commonwealth, what he means is an independent community, and I kind of add the word there, sovereign, right? Like an independent sovereign community is what Locke is referring to when he says Commonwealth. He says that it is most similar to the Latin civitas, civitas. I don't know how to pronounce Latin, but maybe that's close. And that it's not the same thing as a community or a city, or even probably a nation, right? That's more of a modern term. Again, this is one of those things where, why are you defining one of your most fundamental terms in Chapter 10? From a critique perspective, it's just kind of silly. From a philosophical perspective, there's not much to critique here other than, why didn't you say this earlier? We kind of had to guess it up until this point, which, is not necessarily the best tactic. But that is chapters 9 and 10 of Locke's second treatise on government. Chapter 9 is about what government is supposed to do and it is about what government is for, what powers they have, what powers people joining a society give up, and what the obligations of those with power are. Chapter 9, despite being short, is a fairly important chapter because it outlines, for instance, the 3 branches of traditional, classical liberal government: legislative, judicial, executive. The part that gets missed by modern governments is the obligations of those holding power, right? We no longer have a situation where we aren't governed by decree. We no longer have indifferent and upright judges who decide by the laws, and we no longer have the force of community only being used to execute laws or defend against invaders. And so, by that logic, the government of the United States is already dissolved into a pretty bad tyranny, at least by Lockean standards. Chapter 10 is just definitions, and there's not much to complain about those definitions, except that Locke is not being careful enough to say, like, oh, by the way, like, the king can't just be king forever. That's an easy path to tyranny, and also that Chapter 10 should have been like Chapter 2. Other than that, there's not much else to these 2. Chapter 9 is important, but very short. And so you can get through it pretty quickly, and there's definitely criticisms of it, as I mentioned, but we're going through this bit by bit. So next up, we will be doing Chapter 11, which is of the extent of the legislative power. This is another one of decent length, so we'll probably do just that one next week. But that is the goal, for us to cover Chapter 11 of the extent of legislative power. A little bit of a short one, but we did cover 2 chapters, so I feel like this is pretty decent for 1 week. So I will say, as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with the next chapter. And, things are a bit out of order in this book, and so we're going to have to probably go through the whole thing and then maybe do like a postscript kind of chapter to say, oh, well, here's the things that should have been here, here's the things that should have been here, here's our kind of overall perspective. We'll get there eventually, but we're going to keep going through piecewise for the moment, just so that we don't lose our train of following Locke's his own arguments, as opposed to kind of like layering our own interpretations on top there. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll be back next week with some more of Second Treatise on government. There we go. Or Second Treatise of government. Whatever. Anyway, see y'all later.